Initially, the idea for the show was to look at interesting and hopeful signs that are counteracting what's going on in the media right now, the future that's being foisted upon us. But we're veering around a little and tending to focus on my dual interests, art and politics. And with that in mind, today's guest, Mike Watson, is situated right in the middle of both. Mike has a PhD in philosophy. He's a theorist, critic, and curator. He's written for Art Review, Art Forum, Frieze, Radical Philosophy. And like me, he's a Zero Books author as well. He has a book coming out this fall called Can the Left Learn to Meme? He had a book earlier called Toward a Conceptual Militancy. Very engaged thinker in that intersection of art and politics, which I think is crucial today, and I think can lead us out of the conundrum we seem to be in conceptually and in terms of a larger meaning. I wanted to say spiritually, but that has connotations I don't enjoy. So let's say meaningfully lead us out of this conundrum. And so, our guest, Mike, are you here?
Hey, hi,
hey,
can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you so much for being on our show today. Can you talk a little about yourself and what you're writing on before we get into the subjects?
Okay, yeah, well, thanks for having me. When you say what I'm writing on, do you mean generally or...?
Yes, I mean, your topics, as I was saying about this program and my own interest, your topics tend to be not only art and politics, but that intersection between them, and if you can put a line under that, the media that connects them, that allows us to even have this kind of discussion.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think this question you're asking about how we would get out of the conundrum we're in is an interesting one, and I think the study of the intersection of art and politics exists because there's this kind of frustrating kind of boundary or passage between the two fields, which one hopes you could unite, because art is a field in which we can dream anything, but can't really do anything. Whereas politics is a field where we are kind of charged with doing stuff, which means actually a lot of our dreams come to nothing. So, it's kind of an attempt to marry the dream, the things you can dream about with no consequence, with the field where consequences are everything, and as such, our dreams kind of come crashing down. So if we could ever somehow unify these, maybe we would make some progress socially, but by definition, they can't be unified because they're really kind of fundamentally opposed.
As a kid, I introduced this with my own background. As a young teen, 11-year-old even, I read, and this is in small-town Kentucky, which was effectively nowhere, not even on a map at that point, really. I read a lot about the Dadaists, and I read a lot about some of the early explorations of the possibilities of art to interact with society, I guess we'll use that term. And I was fascinated. And what you're talking about with the ability to dream anything really just, it blew me away. And at the same time, given, I come from a working class family, I had to work. And I really, my papa or grandfather introduced me to the writings of Marx, of Ingersoll in the United States. And I saw that dilemma between having to go to work and dealing with that kind of misery and working from a young age, and that ridiculous open-ended possibility that art was offering. And I thought that here in 2019 especially, that gap between the possibility teased at by art and the sadness and misery of our daily lives inflicted on us by our economic system would have closed. What do you think?
Yes.
Yeah,
yep.
Go ahead.
I mean, it's not. Yeah, I think one issue is not whether the gap has closed, but literally in a sense that we probably have a lot of what we would have wished for decades ago. but the expectation has grown. So, so there's still this gap, which is still significant. And I'm speaking particularly of the West, because obviously, in other parts of the world, then people just, they live in kind of a dire state of poverty, whereas the poverty we live with is partly to do with status and to do with a feeling of being unfulfilled in comparison to where we think we should be, which is a kind of de-subjectification. We don't feel complete. Which is nothing insignificant. It's a very real alienation which we suffer, which I kind of think is ratcheted up. Is kind of raised by social media culture and the kind of need to sustain a kind of certain level of attention directed towards one's activities or a certain image. So yeah, I think we certainly have this massive gap between what is obtainable, kind of ultimately, and then what is obtainable by most people. So anyone can now become famous, but most of us won't. Whether that even be a dream. Anyone can become rich, but most of us won't. So it's kind of somewhere towards the kind of democracy we dreamed of, and it was kind of expressed in the European avant-garde Dadaism, this kind of thing, the idea that anything can be art, and anyone, this is going a bit later towards Joseph Beuys, the artist, the idea that anyone can be an artist. These kind of twinned ideas give a lot of hope, but they don't really translate to the material world of work and economic resources. So yeah, I see that gap for sure. But I think the gap is, unfortunately, is also evident in the art world, to perhaps even a greater degree to many fields. For example, a big study conducted in the UK, I think it was 2015, called Panic, about employment in the arts fields, basically said that 80% of all arts workers are middle class. So we still have this massive problem actually in the field itself. So that the field kind of charged with opening things up and making anything possible is actually very closed. Right. So that kind of has another level of disappointment.
That's an interesting thing that I saw. I lived in New York City and still have a studio there, actually, but lived there for a decade. And I told a gentleman one night, I went along Broome Street, all through the Lower East Side at a gallery night, and almost everyone exhibiting, with a couple of notable, wonderful exceptions, but almost everyone was exhibiting what I would consider to be aesthetic pablum. It was very uninteresting, and I was looking at they posted their resumes, and they were, without exception, RISD grads or Yale grads. That takes a lot of money to get there, and very few people get enough of a scholarship and student loans to come there from an economically lower or disenfranchised position. So you have, like you said, not only middle class, but even upper middle class people making art. And as a student of art history, it seems to me that often those people we respect as the challenging artists come from a more economically challenged position, even if it's one they've created themselves, unfortunately. But they don't come necessarily through the pipeline of the upper middle class, privileged, entitled, and also taken very seriously position that those artists in the Lower East Side did. And I find that disturbing, that kind of social bifurcation between the wealthy, so-called wealthy, upper middle class today isn't that wealthy, but and the impoverished exist in the art world as well.
I mean, for sure, yeah. This is a pattern I've seen. I was really noticing about 3 or 4 years ago. I guess maybe it was more like 4 or 5 years ago, where I lived in Rome, in Italy, at the time. I just found myself surrounded, generally by upper bourgeois or aristocrats in a literal sense, and I found myself talking to people in confidence and saying, look, I keep finding that everyone in the art world here is at least upper bourgeois, home-owning, from a young age, right, and privileged. And then it would turn out the person I was speaking to was from the same class. Maybe they wouldn't tell me, but I would say, I was speaking yesterday to I don't know, say Paolo, and I said this, and then they would say, well, Paolo's also an aristocrat. And I just suddenly realized that the whole mechanism was somehow there to support the class itself. And I wonder if there's something internal in art that has always been kind of aimed at the security of the middle class.
I think so. And I wrestle with the fact that art, to me, always rests on blood money. Your average, I don't like that word, but a person who's a welder, say, in Tennessee, and this is my reference point, so it could be many other places, but they have the advantage of at least being first world poor, and not, in those dire positions to which you referred earlier. But that person can't go into a gallery and buy a painting, in part because just the time commitment to most paintings that are worthwhile tends to be reflected in a high price tag. And so that person can't go in and buy art, and they're already excluded from the consideration of the art market. And I wonder how we can get beyond that, and how we can, going back to what I was talking about originally, which is part of the art, politics, economic nexus about what you write. What I saw in the Dadaists was this breaking down of the salon culture and breaking down of the limitations that would prevent a welder in Tennessee, for instance, from going into a gallery and buying something. Art was demeaned economically, though aesthetically exalted still. And that intrigued me. It almost reminded me of some of the experimentation I saw from reading about it in the 60s, where you have performances in the street, or Robert Fripp going into offices and performing music. Like, you're beginning to bring something that's that is at least ostensibly about human liberation, but is in practice about economic exclusion to people that are economically excluded.
I mean, that can be valuable for sure, and there are many examples. I suppose, it's the case that art, what we call contemporary art, the kind of the art world that has a kind of base of support, in the sense that, there are certain galleries that have connections with certain collectors and critics who work for certain magazines, so they together they give accreditation. They kind of jointly kind of interacting as people who give credence to certain artists as being worthy. You see what I mean?
Yeah,
so, if you don't have that, you can do art, in any kind of space, in public spaces, in education spaces, supermarkets. You can have these kind of performative gestures maybe in the streets that are designed to make people think and make people discuss. But unfortunately, the artists maybe will suffer if they don't have the accreditation of a given art foundation or museum. So this is like the kind of payoff. So I think certainly what you're discussing can happen and should happen, but economically isn't always viable. It's the kind of the economic security that the museums and gallery network with certain magazines manage to kind of give to people.
No, I totally agree with that. And that, unfortunately, that economic security really underpins a lot of creative freedom. You don't have that creative freedom when you're working, as I've said, like a welder in Tennessee or as a server in a restaurant. Looking at what could have and may still, but what could have brought us to a situation of transformation where we overcome that economic and political gap. You wrote about, you thought after the collapse in 2007, 2008, that we would have some sort of transformation of the arts, that there would be some sort of movement between art and politics that would be, if I can use the term, liberating. Can you say more about that?
I mean, for sure. Just after the economic crisis, there was a massive growth in political art making, and I think it's the first book, Towards a Conceptual Militancy, where I talk about how political art making suddenly became kind of in vogue, and this being in a sense positive, but also problematic. And basically, what happened is that I think there was a feeling coming from galleries and museums, but also from artists, that the art world simply had to respond to the massive injustice of the economic crisis and then the subsequent bank bailout, which actually left the public paying for the banks to survive. And I think also there was still this kind of almost a trauma in the wake of Afghanistan and Iraq that had to be addressed.
Right.
And so people started supporting political art, but this is problematic because the art world is still very much part of the finance mechanism. It's very much entwined with finance and investment, and also it has discriminatory practices against lower class people and groups who are non-white and women, etc.
Right.
So you have these issues, but on top of that, I think one of the main reasons that political sentiment migrated into the arts is because it couldn't anymore achieve anything in politics. So you had this situation where there was a kind of explosion, particularly in Italy, where I was at that point, of kind of artworks and cultural initiatives that really kind of talked about issues around capitalism and exploitation. But of course, when it's art, it's not politics by definition. It's toothless.
Right.
So you have this situation which maybe is quite safe for the powers that be. So, but there was a massive growth in political art making. Particularly interesting for me was an initiative in an occupied theatre called Teatro Valle, which basically means the Valle Theatre, which was Rome's oldest functioning theatre, which was at risk of being sold off to private interests. So it got occupied by theatre workers who ran a programme of free theatre for actually 3 years, I think, before it got evicted. And they had a really high-level international programme, and it was all very much oriented around their own kind of commons style view of ownership and the economy.
Right.
So there certainly have been positive developments, but I think it's almost kind of come to it's reached a limit point now. We're seeing really quite alarming signs out of America with the political establishment there, Trump being president, getting more worrying weekly in his kind of rhetoric. Brexit in Britain, the League of Five-Star Coalition in Italy. These are really, we're heading towards something similar without wanting to sound kind of shrill. We're heading something similar to fascism, and I don't know that art on its own is going to be able to stop that, or we need something a bit more incisive.
No, I agree with that, and I don't think it's being hyperbolic to describe the situation globally as a fascist moment. I mean, just by definition, fascism is an intertwining of corporations and the state at its very foundation, and that's already happened. But now you have the cultural rollout of fascism with attacks on minorities and women and so forth, and the arts. There's a book called Art and the Anarchist Imagination. Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm not. No. I
usually remember these things very well. I don't remember the author. I actually have a copy of the book, but it's brilliant, and it talks. Oh no, sorry, Film and the Anarchist Imagination, because it specifically is focused on film. But the point the author makes is that leftist politics have won in the arts. That if you look at the arts, with Bouguereau and the salon painters in France at the end of the 19th century, the late 19th century, going to the late 20th century, there are no limitations on what you can do. And a lot of the imposed cultural restrictions are gone, which is what some socialists, a lot of communists, anarcho-communist anarchists were attempting to do politically, that has been beaten down. And I see that there's a push coming from these neo-fascists and neo-Nazis in the states that have an ethnic consideration out front with their fascism against the arts. And just like you said, the arts are largely toothless. I'm still intrigued, though, at the possibility that the arts could do something else. And there was that moment with that, from your writing, I see that you share a concern with a moment back in the 90s when the internet, the public version of it, was blossoming. And we thought for a moment that we were going to have a transformation of society, that this publicly accessible media that artists could get a hold of, that various political voices could get a hold of, would bring about a complete reworking of society. And that appears not to be the case, which is disheartening.
For sure, yeah. I mean, I recall in the, I guess it was mid to late 90s when I first used the internet by going to a friend's house. It was. I mean, this was in the UK, so I don't know how things were in the States, but he was the only person with internet in the area. So we used to go to his house, and we used to look up, of all the things you could imagine a group of teenage boys looking up on the internet, we used to look up communist pages.
Right.
Pages from communist groups across Europe and anarchist pages. And the feeling really was, even then, for us as fairly young people, I mean, for sure young people, 16, 17, was that, if this was a medium that allowed for greater democracy and allowed for the accessing of knowledge that was previously kind of confined to perhaps university libraries, it by definition would breed or lead to more democracy, and that we would see a kind of worldwide kind of leftist moment, and it didn't happen. And it wasn't simply a moment of teenage naivety. I think it was something very much echoed by the left at the time, leftist academia at the time, and going on to some point in the 2000s, into the first decade, I think. And I think it kind of ended up kind of failing as a logic with the Arab Spring, I think, and just before that, the Iranian, what we called the Twitter Revolution,
right.
And I think sometimes it's called the Green Revolution, which was basically an uprising that was very, I forget what year, was it 2010, around then, a bit before.
It was a moment. Was 11, so I think the Iranian uprising you're talking about was 10.
Yeah. Okay. So there was thank you. There was a kind of a moment when the world was looking on because the protesters were organising via Twitter, and kind of spreading the messages as well via Twitter. And there were mirror servers set up. I'm not quite sure on the tech, but it basically means that where servers were down in Iran, they could be, there was still access to the internet somehow through some technological help from leftists in the West, or something of this nature. But there was generally a lot of positivity for how Twitter could overturn a kind of despot, religious despot, dictator in Iran. And it didn't work, of course. It failed terribly, and a lot of the people who were using Twitter were then rounded up by government troops and the police and tortured. And also the protests themselves were often intercepted because, of course, the security services were also reading Twitter. So you see a limitation there.
Yeah, that's one.
Go on.
That's one overarching limitation that, as I read online and talk with people, I think it's actually a generational break, because I think people that are middle-aged and above tend to see the internet with its big brother element behind it, and I think people that have been raised on it don't quite understand that someone is always watching you. Even if it's, a computer program, an algorithm, and so forth, you're still being monitored. And if you look at that as a liberating tool, it's got to be taken, with a proverbial grain of salt, because you're not, in a salon in Paris, not a salon, but like a coffee shop in 1880, or in a meeting hall in the 1700s in England or the United States, or the colonies. You could have a discussion that could be considered revolutionary or subversive, and not be overheard. But that doesn't happen today. Someone's listening to this, someone's watching your keystrokes, someone's looking at your Twitter account. Again, even if it's an algorithm.
Yeah, for sure, yeah. And that's a big issue. I mean, there is kind of an increase in freedom and a concomitant increase in control.
Right. And I wrestle with that, and I see in your writings you wrestle with that, which is one of the main reasons, other than your general take on art and politics, that I wanted to have you on the program, because that, there's still this liberating possibility in these technologies, and of course there, this, not, I want to say creeping, but it's more than creeping, but a wave of, what they're now calling surveillance capitalism that's going on behind the scenes. Well, when the early 90s, when the internet was, before it became what we think of as the internet, before it had structured text, that support audio files and all types of animation and things, they had these things called BBSs. Are you familiar with these?
BBS, I'm not sure in the terminology.
Okay.
No.
It might be called something different in different countries. But when you had a dial-up modem and you didn't have to go through the server, you could actually just go through the phone lines, which of course is still another big brother. You could put a site together on your computer. You just had to have your computer to power it. It was very primitive, but you could have some Unix-based graphics, I believe it was, and you could have some photos, but nothing would really move, at least not easily. And if it did, it was very, very primitive. But you could upload files, and you could have group chats. And so, and BBS stands for Bulletin Board System. So you had this proliferation of very citizen-based, almost like the citizen band radio of the 70s in the United States, citizen sites. So people were taking control of the media in that sense. And at the time, one of my interests was cognitive science and neuroscience, and I was following a lot of people that were putting things up like that, along with art. But one volunteer firefighter had put files on artificial life research that he had taken from a server at some university, because all this was very primitive and security was minimal, if that. And so he was uploading curricula from Stanford and so forth that was dealing with artificial life, artificial intelligence. And in the chats, they began to talk about the police force in Cincinnati, specifically the sheriff, who's notorious for being, frankly, fascistic, Simon Lease. And Lease actually went to one of the servers, went to the house of someone who was powering a bigger BBS, and did a police raid claiming there was child pornography on there. And there was a hearing in Cincinnati that I went to, and nearly a riot at the hearing. I mean, it was volatile and beautiful, because you got to see democracy in all of its chaotic mess play out there. And to me, that was actually, as grim as it was hopeful, because someone, as a citizen, you couldn't do this. You can't really get easily into your TV set. It's very small. And you had to have, they called it snowbox hacking back then to break into a TV program. But you could affect the perception of the sheriff's department and comment in real time, and that to me was beautiful. And I'm sad and excited still, but sad to see where this has gone. You have those revolutions of 2010, 2011 that were happening all over the world, potential revolutions, and and then the empowerment of a demagogue like Trump as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly still two tendencies. I want to just kind of address this issue of we were talking earlier about where the hope for the arts has gone, the hope for a kind of a left wing or political art moment has gone, and I think you just asked where the hope for the internet has gone, but I think the hope for left wing art or a kind of left wing creative expression has gone onto the internet, right. Although it was already kind of there. But we have this moment of kind of mass left memeing, and we have this, what we now call breadtube, left-wing YouTube, video production and channels, as well as Twitch now, which has a number of leftist streamers.
Yeah, I've heard more about. Can you spell those for people? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but spell those for people. I know Twitch is spelled just like it is, but this is new to a lot of people. And BreadTube.
Yeah, I mean, Twitch basically is a live streaming site. So it's a site upon which one can stream themselves. Actually, was designed for people streaming computer games. So they would play computer games, and they can also kind of appear on screen during the gameplay and talk with people. And then the public can talk back through type. There's like a chat window. So it's very interactive, and it actually has become a kind of major media outlet used by also kind of, we could say, almost cabaret. I'm not sure you'd say cabaret, but people who entertain, they talk, they chat, they dance.
Sure.
People who do comedy, talk shows, and things like that. So it's enabled people to basically run their own TV channel, and they can get, in the thousands or tens of thousands of viewers simultaneously. And then BreadTube, which is basically YouTube, but YouTube used by leftists. So it basically means left-wing content, videos made on YouTube, and then you can also live stream on YouTube. So there's like a big growth in left-wing, we say sites, left-wing channels on YouTube, and it sort of came from nowhere. It really felt that the blogosphere, because there was a kind of, I suppose, intermediate period between what I was talking about earlier, what you were just talking about, the kind of early internet and prior to the internet as we know it, and what we have now with a kind of a growth in left-wing video makers and live streamers. There was a moment of blogging. It kind of was really called more the philosophical blogosphere rather than the leftist, but it was a lot of leftists talking about philosophy.
Right.
People like Nina Power, who's actually restarted her blog. She's having some controversy I won't go into now, but Nina Power was one of them. Mark Fisher, late Mark Fisher, who wrote Capitalist Realism for Zero Books. Graham Harman, right. And a number of other people. And the thing was, some of them were lecturers or full professors who would write on their blogs, and then there were often comment sections, so people could kind of comment, and they would open dialogues with students who often weren't their own students. So you had this bizarre thing where if you were studying a BA or higher level at that time, you often couldn't get access to your own professors, because there's always this kind of gap, which was still quite significant in the early 2000s, I'll tell you. But you could end up talking to Mark Fisher or Graham Harman, excuse me, as I did. That's actually how I ended up meeting both of them and had dialogues with them.
Yeah, I remember.
That great moment. Sorry, go on.
No, I remember that moment. There was Live Journal. There were other things where people would have like extended discussions, and like you said, those would be accompanied by people that actually were, I don't like the term experts, but had spent a lot of time with the material. I'm still, I wrestle with this idea, which your writing as a whole, to me, deals with, which is how, as an artist, as a creator, I can get off of that capitalist platform. And, we're both authors through Zero Books. And we both know Douglas Lane, and the publisher. Douglas Lane and I have talked a lot, I would say, but we talked some about this idea of the artist as a political subject. To me, one difficulty conceptually with left-wing politics has been that there's been a focus on the subject of politics as the worker, which I don't like, because even though it's obviously you could analyze, how people are working, their labor, what they're giving, what they're getting from it, alienation and so forth, you still, by definition, are trapping them within a performative role that works toward the capitalist system. I think it's easier to conceptualize our lives and politics from the standpoint of an artist. There just seems to be a hurdle in getting to an idea of how we function which I mean daily in that quotidian sense, how we function without being a worker. Am I being clear on that, or is that just is that too?
I mean, you kind of mean that if I understood that.
It's almost something that we don't seem to be able to understand because we can't seem to think of our lives without a job. And
well, I think that leftist discourse, it kind of reduces us to workers, and I think out of necessity, because that was the only way a poor person kind of gained capital, in the sense that their own work was their capital.
Right.
But it's not maybe something free. It's a kind of subjectivity on someone else's terms.
Exactly.
So what art does is maybe gives you a way of declaring your subjectivity on your own terms, and I think that is kind of the key to how we might kind of create a deception and conceive ourselves as free within a kind of complete society and system that is, we could say, unfree or not free. So, the question becomes, how are we going to get around this where we can do all these great things on the internet, which are way beyond our imagination decades ago or even really 10 years ago, thinking of what we have now. But we're still somehow trapped and feeding back into the system. So I think, at some point, one has to go, okay, well, I am, but I'm going to say I'm not.
Right.
Or I'm going to act within that system. And I think this is where art can be valuable, because art is all about deceptions. That whether it be a painting of a sunflower or a landscape or a sculpture of a hero or heroine or something, that's a declaration that something is something it's not. So stone becomes a human figure, paint and canvas becomes a landscape.
Right.
So I think art has always been about saying something is something it isn't. So it's one discipline that can kind of hold its head high whilst kind of presenting the falsity that we are free subjects. And, once you've done that, then what, in a way, saying you're a free subject is all there is to being a free subject.
Right. Yeah. That declaration.
There are other kind of course, it's unfulfilling if you're in prison or otherwise compromised. But, in a sense, we are all compromised, so we're not, I don't think we have to excuse ourselves on that front. Obviously there are different levels of subjugation. I don't want to belittle other people who are probably much worse off than we are.
Right.
But, on a kind of cognitive level, the art declaration, this is art, or this is a tree or a portrait of a human. One can say, I am a free subject, as an art declaration, and then you kind of have to then pick up the pieces from there. And if you're not doing that, you don't really have any hope at all. So, it's kind of like, it's the last recourse we're left with. So whilst it sounds like a really kind of silly, over-wishful way of thinking, then one can just declare themselves free. It's actually kind of saying, well, we have no, we can say we're not free, but then we're really screwed. So yeah. I think we have to say we are, and the creativity, which isn't very easy in art spaces if you're not from a middle class or upper class background, that is now happening on the internet, and it's happening almost constantly. So I think there is some kind of hope in a tentative way.
Yeah, and the internet, there's intimation of the internet being its own economic engine in a way, and allowing us to function in a different economic model. I hate talking about that in a way, because I think whatever it is so nascent that it's not really it's so unformed that to make declarations about it is premature. But I think there is something there, because, like you said, it's so easy now for someone to get online and present a performance or a podcast or even a tour of their opening, an exhibit or something like that, an exhibition. And we didn't have that before. I remember, again, in the early, actually mid-'90s, I was reviewing zines for a couple of publications, and I was going to put out a zine. I went and picked out a book on magazines that was considered top of the line at the time, written by Leonard Mogul. And it was disheartening but enlightening, because he talked about how you need 5 years of budgeting before you put out a magazine of any sort. You'll need to get sponsors, investors, a team together, and a lot of the people that were producing interesting zines at the time were working at a Kinko's or something like that, and they were typing these onto the new desktop publishing softwares that were coming out, printing them up, putting some horrible photographs, horrible in the sense of technically horrible, with the reproductions, and printing these at night free and binding them and selling them that way. So you went from you needing a $500,000 budget over a 5-year span and a working team to just a job from which you could get free printing late at night. That's fascinating, and the fact that you can do that online now, not only with your exhibit, but with performances, with reading your writing, for instance, is fantastic. You don't have to have much money at all to do that.
Yeah, I mean, indeed, the economic relation is the kind of elephant in the room, so to speak. That we can say art can somehow be liberating, but ultimately we can't change society without changing the economic structure. But with the internet, as you're suggesting, that for one, it's very internet and modern kind of apps, contemporary computer apps. One, it's very affordable to make things, but two, you can actually directly monetize them. So there are sites like Patreon, right, as you may say, where you can kind of make a profile and you can ask people for donations to support your writing or video making, etc. And then, of course, we are directly making money for somebody with every kind of, basically every click we make on the internet, and also every post we make on social media. So there's clearly a correlation between the creation of just about anybody who uses the internet and money. So it suggests that there's something that could be done. That, if we were to reorder, who that money was going to.
Yeah, it's that type of function that makes me actually think of the beginnings of the emergence of a new economic model. Just because with Patreon, you can actually, you're paying for the art, but you're not paying for the art. You're donating, and the art is free, which is conceptually ambiguous. I was reading about a program at different municipalities in England where they were paying people to volunteer to do certain civic functions. And to say that you're paying someone to volunteer is a contradiction, just as is having free access to your art with a donation is a contradiction. But the fact that we have those contradictions and we're actually employing them, to me, speaks of something new. It's whenever I've done research into philosophical conundrums, I look for those moments when our speech seems to bend and contain a contradictory pair of elements. So the paid volunteerism or the free art for a donation, that tells me something's going on. And it's not going on enough that, or at least fully fleshed out enough that I think we have a name for it or anything. But that's a possibility of something emerging. What do you think of? You were involved with. I guess you were the founder of the Nomos Foundation in Italy, in Rome. Can you say something about that? Because that was providing free arts education, correct?
It was actually a project called Towards the Free Education, which was funded by the Nomos Foundation. But yeah, I founded this kind of education project that the idea was that it would run a free education system within the art world, so as to kind of circumvent some of the problems with education more widely, such as the kind of the close link between the state and the education system, for example, and the fact that education systems were largely written by, or at least they were initially made compulsory by and funded by nation states to provide workforces that were pliant and useful for the needs of industrial capitalism,
yes,
for example. So over a couple of years in Rome and then in Venice, in the Venice Biennale, which is a large biannual art festival in Venice, we held a number of performances and free courses, and the idea was to form a kind of ongoing education system within the art world. But actually, what happened is that at that point I started to realise that everyone around me, certainly in any position of power, but also many of the artists, were from a middle class or higher background. So I thought, well, hang on, this is going to be co-opted and made kind of bourgeois. So my interest focused, it shifted towards social class critique. So as a project, it kind of got stalled. But then it got brought on and became the book towards a conceptual militancy, which basically argues that if you take this kind of the idea that anything can be art, as Duchamp kind of suggested, or he pushed things this way. Marcel Duchamp, when he displayed normal household objects as artwork, such as urinals and bottle racks and things, if you take that and combine it with Joseph Beuys's statement of German artists operating, mostly post-war, World War II. Right. If you take his statement that anyone can be an artist, so you mix these two things, that anything can be art, but anyone can be an artist, then literally, one can literally declare even the political system to be art, or the education system to be art. So what the book suggests is that the extreme of the idea that anyone can make art or declare anything of art would be us reconstituting the political system and education system in the art world. And what that does is, because art bears no responsibility, it means you can imagine anything. You can kind of dream anything. But the idea was that it would provoke people. The statement really was one that, if we really believe in political art making, because people were really kind of getting into this political art making, as we discussed earlier, right. Since the economic crisis, then one should just do politics in art spaces. But the thing is, it literally was a provocation, and I knew it wouldn't happen. So it's kind of saying, if we really mean this, do it, and if not, then maybe the answer resides elsewhere, which is where the next book coming out comes in. Can the left learn to meme? Right. Can the left learn to meme? Which says that kind of the democratic potential of art, the idea of an art for all, has migrated to the internet, but it's not how we really hoped it would be, because people are looking at mostly cat memes, the Kardashians, and then a lot of stuff that's more unsavory even than that. They're not making left-wing revolutions or anything. But then we have to ask, is that a bad thing? Right. So, if you give people the tools to educate themselves, however, and they end up making cat memes, then maybe one has to see what comes from that.
Yeah, that brings up an entirely other set of questions, and we're almost out of time. So on the note of that entire other set of questions, I would like to have you on again. I know that your book from Zero Books, Can the Left Learn to Meme, won't be out until November. So maybe we can have you on to talk more about what it means that when given freedom, people make cat memes, and what that implies about us socially and individually. But let me lead out with a question I ask myself a lot. Politics today, to me, especially in the U.S., is largely theater. And I know, of course, you could say it always is, but a lot of the fascist elements that are going on today and the drudging up of some of the worst members of our society and exciting them is theater to distract for bilking of state and federal treasuries by the economic elite. I'm wondering, though, what would we as leftists do to create an art that counteracts that? Do you have any ideas on that? Is that question clear?
But you were saying the politics is theatre.
You were talking about politics as art, or art as politics. And just taking that, I see a lot of what goes on with the current occupant of the White House and a lot of the monstrous people around him as theater, to produce a spectacle to distract people from a lot of the basic robberies that are going on underneath the system, and collapse, economic and environmental, that's going on that they don't want to address. So,
I get you now. Yeah, okay. First of all, I'd be happy to come back for sure. Thank you. And then to answer the question, I think you're right that the politicians are engaging in theatre and in a more conscious way even than before. And this thing of Trump telling the 4 congresswomen, is it?
Yes.
To go home, it's a deliberate distraction. It's a theatre working on a level of distraction.
Yes.
And we have to be very wary of this. That the racist rhetoric being stepped up is kind of a way of cheapening political discourse as a whole, and I think we're falling for it. And I think the thing is, Trump is very good. And I don't know if it's even just him. I don't think it can be just him. I think there are people that are really kind of playing a kind of game, and they're using him. I think the way Trump is being used, and it's similar with Salvini in Italy, and Boris Johnson, who will probably soon be Prime Minister in England, is I think in Britain is going the same way. The thing is to kind of throw a spanner in the works and kind of break sensible political discussion.
Yes.
Through a kind of abstraction, through a kind of madness, throwing kind of very bizarre statements around. And I think we may have no choice but to respond with an abstraction of our own.
Yes, and that's...
to beat our heritage.
Let's save that, because I'd like to have you on again and talk about those 2 points, what we as artists can do. Because, I have a habit, especially if I'm having a glass or 2 or 3 of wine, to say something really nasty to Trump on Twitter. And I've looked back through what I've said, and I've said other things, to Roy Moore and to a lot of these monstrous people. And it's satisfying emotionally for that moment. But it lowers me, I think, as a speaker, as a thinker, to address them, even if it's funny at that, what I'm saying. The point is that it's occupying my time and my mental energy and my creative energy in these distractions. And so I'm again wondering what I can do as an artist, and that's a.
Well, I think this is crucial. Is that the abstraction is not complete if it is kind of latching on to a real world object and getting angry with it. I think that is playing into a game we're probably best leaving alone. I think we need a complete abstraction. I'm talking about something surreal, or what Mark Fisher in his last unfinished work called Acid Communism, which is something taking off as a meme, yes. A kind of an absurd visual response, maybe, to kind of upset things.
And that links into Adorno's Shudder. That I want to talk about that when you come on the program next. I know people can find your books at Zero Books, which is at zero-books.net. Where else can they find information about you?
That's a good question. I mean, if they Google me, they will probably find things on me, although there's really a lot of Mike Watson's. But, I mean, Google Mike Watson and Adorno.
Okay.
Theodore Adorno, or Zero Books. You'll find various things.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. Like I said, your focus is really where a lot of my focus is as an artist and a thinker, trying to figure out how to get out of this box, which is, looking at that blood money that's always behind the arts, and looking at that, the fact that the vampiric nature of the so-called art market takes creation and turns it into a quantity, a dollar. And it's almost easier to weld for a living, or cook at a restaurant for a living, or work construction and make art afterwards than to sacrifice things immediately. Well, Mike, thank you so much, and I really want to have you on because your books address those questions that we were ending with. We have 1 hour of those, so when I bring you back, we'll enter right with those.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been great for me, and I'll definitely come back. Okay.
All right. You have a good day, and thank you again.
Cheers. Okay.